All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unraveling one of history's absolute biggest, most captivating mysteries. Seriously, we're talking about an ancient hidden wall made of solid iron, an unseen apocalyptic army, and a prophecy that has literally spanned thousands of years. We're going to explore the enigmatic narrative of Yajuj and Majuj, or as you probably know them in the West, Gog and Magog. By piecing together geographical clues, historical records, and ancient religious texts, we're going to reconstruct exactly what the source material tells us about this looming threat. It's an incredible, mind-bending journey through history and prophecy, so let's dive right in. To hook right into the ancient narrative, these texts paint an absolutely chilling picture. Just imagine an unseen army trapped behind a massive barrier. According to the traditions we're looking at, every single morning for the past 2.5 millennia, they dig. They chip away at this wall relentlessly. When the sun sets, they stop, and their leader says, "Okay, stop, we're going to finish it tomorrow." But overnight, the texts say, the wall is divinely restored. It becomes even stronger than before. Yet the prophecy states that one day their leader will finally say, "We will finish it tomorrow, inshallah," meaning if God wills it. And on that day, the wall will not rebuild. The threat's going to finally break free. But before we can really understand this threat, we have to find the wall. And to find the wall, well, we need to find the guy who built it. In the Quranic chapter Surah Al-Kahf, this enigmatic builder is given a very specific title, Zulqarnain. Translated, that means the two-horned one. Now, the texts don't actually give us a specific name. Instead, they give us a description of a profoundly just, powerful, monotheistic king, a ruler who traveled all the way to the east, all the way to the west, and eventually found himself situated right between two mountains. There, a vulnerable group of people essentially begged him to protect them from a devastating force. And here's the kicker. He didn't even ask for tribute. Instead, he built an absolutely massive, awe-inspiring barrier forged out of iron and molten brass. So naturally, for thousands of years, scholars have been debating who exactly was this historical figure. For a long time, the dominant view among a lot of scholars was that this builder, Zulqarnain, was Alexander the Great. Now, why Alexander? Well, because he famously conquered both the East and the West, reaching all the way to the Jhelum River in modern-day Pakistan. Plus, if you look at ancient Syriac Christian legends, written a couple of centuries before Islam, they actually contain really similar stories about Alexander building a wall against Gog and Magog. So early scholars saw that connection and naturally just adopted it. But as we start digging into the actual historical record, a pretty major mismatch starts to emerge. Yeah, when we look a bit closer, things just don't add up. Surah Al-Kahf describes a deeply pious ruler, right? A strict monotheist who established justice, protected the oppressed, and submitted entirely to a single creator. But let's look at Alexander's actual historical rap sheet. He ruthlessly burned down Persepolis, he executed his own generals, and most glaringly, he literally declared himself the son of Amun, an Egyptian sun god. He claimed complete divinity for himself. So the crucial question is this: how on earth could a man who declared himself a god be the exact same pious, humble servant of the one God described in the sacred texts? The profiles simply do not align. And that brings us to an incredibly compelling second candidate, Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire around 559 BCE. The geographical overlaps here are honestly striking. The texts say Zulqarnain traveled east. Well, Cyrus's empire stretched all the way into Central Asia. The texts say he traveled west. Cyrus famously conquered Babylon in the west in 539 BCE. Beyond that, historical records show Cyrus was a Zoroastrian, a follower of a monotheistic faith, and he never forced his religion on the people he conquered. And get this, in the 20th century, archaeologists excavating near his tomb in Iran found an ancient stone relief. What did it depict? A figure with two prominent winged horns. Literally, the two-horned one. But hold on, because the evidence gets even more fascinating. The texts really highlight Zulqarnain as a fierce protector of the oppressed. Well, back in 1879, a British archaeologist unearthed a clay cylinder in the ruins of Babylon. This is the famous Cyrus cylinder. Written in Akkadian cuneiform, it records Cyrus stating that he freed the enslaved, allowed displaced peoples to finally return home, and permitted absolutely everyone to worship freely. This incredible artifact from 539 BCE is widely considered to be the world's very first charter of human rights. And incredibly, today, a replica of it sits perfectly displayed at the United Nations headquarters. The whole world praises his legacy, even if a lot of folks don't realize he might just be the legendary builder from the Quran. So if Cyrus is our who, we've got to transition to the where. Where exactly is this massive wall of iron and brass? The text in Surah Al-Kahf maps out 3 distinct geographical journeys. There's one to the east, one to the west, and then a third journey in a completely different direction. It's on this third journey that he reaches a narrow valley between 2 steep mountains and finds a group of people whose language he could barely even understand, who beg him to build this wall. So let's impartially test a couple of the most popular geographical theories out there against these specific textual clues.
First up, we have the Great Wall of China. Seems like the obvious choice, right? It's huge! But let's actually check the criteria. The Great Wall is made of mud, brick, and stone, not iron and brass. Plus, it stretches out for thousands of kilometers. It's definitely not confined to a narrow valley between 2 mountains. So we can kind of cross that one off the list. The second popular theory points to the Himalayas. Makes sense, it's the world's largest mountain range. However, remember those clues? The texts explicitly state the third journey was in a different direction from the east. Since the Himalayas are way out in the east, this trajectory is highly inconsistent with the source material. And this brilliantly illustrates why modern scholars point to a highly specific third location, the Darial Pass in the Caucasus Mountains. This pass sits directly north, which perfectly matches that third directional journey we talked about. It is a terrifyingly narrow gorge positioned exactly between 2 towering mountains, sitting right on the modern-day border of Georgia and Russia. And it gets better. In this region, near Derbent, there are literal physical remains of ancient walls built with stone and iron. So the geographical trajectory, the physical description of the valley, and the actual building materials, they all perfectly align with the ancient texts. But the texts don't just dwell in ancient history. They actually pivot sharply to a terrifying apocalyptic future. What happens when that daily digging finally breaches the iron wall? Surah Al-Anbiya gives us a pretty stark warning. It says that when Yajuj and Majuj are finally unleashed, they are going to swarm down from every single elevation, just pouring in from every corner of the earth, rapidly and overwhelmingly. The source material actually outlines specific signs and events that will mark their arrival, and it brings this ancient prophecy right into the scope of our modern world.
To ground this geographically, the texts point to a very specific body of water, the Sea of Galilee. According to an authentic hadith, the first wave of this army is going to pass by the Sea of Galilee, which is over in modern-day Israel, and they'll drink from it. By the time the very last of their army passes through, they'll look around and say, wow, there used to be water here. Now I want you to consider the year 2018. In that specific year, the Sea of Galilee actually hit its lowest recorded historical levels. While sure, geopolitical factors are definitely at play today, it's wild to think the source texts were naming and highlighting this specific lake's vulnerability centuries before anyone understood its modern environmental fragility. The texts also give us a look into their psychological state. Classical scholars note a tradition where this force will literally shoot their arrows up into the sky, and those arrows will return coated in blood. They will arrogantly proclaim that they've killed the inhabitants of the heavens. So the crucial point we need to take away here is the metaphor. It represents this ultimate, unchecked arrogance, a mindset that completely rejects the divine, believing humanity itself is God and that there is absolutely nothing above them. It really asks us to look around today and consider, is that extreme arrogance, that total rejection of any higher power, already taking root in our modern mindset? And the texts tell us the clock is already ticking. There is a profound sense of urgency woven into the source material. According to a hadith in Sahih Bukhari, the Prophet Muhammad awoke one day in a sheer state of alarm, warning of an approaching trial. He actually formed a small circle with his fingers, stating that a breach in the wall of Yajuj and Majuj had already opened, a hole the exact size of a small ring. Now, remember, that was over 14 centuries ago. If a hole that size existed way back then, the texts urge us to imagine just how incredibly fragile that barrier must be today. It's also important to note that the texts don't just present these apocalyptic events randomly. They are highly structured. First, you have the appearance of the just leader, Imam Mahdi. Second, the emergence of the great deceiver, the Dajjal. Third, the descent of Jesus. Fourth, Jesus defeats the Dajjal. And finally, the fifth stage is the release of Yajuj and Majuj. They are presented as the ultimate physical threat, coming only after the great spiritual deception of the Dajjal has been dealt with. So according to the texts, it is a sequential, inescapable timeline. So how does it all end? Well, the texts reveal a pretty shocking resolution. No human military force can defeat Yajuj and Majuj. Instead, Jesus will lead the believers to retreat high into the mountains for safety. Then, the texts state, God will send a single type of insect or plague that will wipe out the entire apocalyptic army overnight. Gone.
Following this, massive, heavy, cleansing rains will wash the earth clean. And the aftermath? It isn't some barren, dystopian wasteland. It's an era of unimaginable agricultural abundance. The texts literally say the earth will reset so beautifully that a single pomegranate will be large enough to feed an entire family. It's this profound promise of a beautiful, cleansing reset rather than just absolute destruction.
Now, all of this brings us to a deep philosophical paradox found right in the source material. In Surah Al-Kahf, immediately after building this impenetrable iron wall, Zulqarnain says, "This is a mercy from my Lord. But when the promise of my Lord comes, he will level it to the ground." He knew the wall wasn't permanent. He knew for a fact that one day the apocalyptic threat would break through and completely shatter his masterpiece. So, you gotta ask yourself, if he knew it was ultimately going to fail, why did he spend all that massive time and effort building it in the first place? The answer lies in the concept of duty. This is brilliantly captured by a traditional Punjabi proverb found alongside the source material. The gardener's duty is to water the plants. Whether they bear fruit or not is up to the master. Zulqarnain didn't build that wall to stop the end of the world. He built it because, in that specific moment, for those specific vulnerable people standing in front of him, it was his duty to protect them. The final outcome? That belonged to the divine. But the effort, the labor, and the responsibility of the present moment, that belonged entirely to him. And honestly, that is exactly what you should take away from this explainer. The texts present a massive, unstoppable sequence of apocalyptic events. You cannot stop the wall from breaking. You cannot stop the prophesied sequence. But the ultimate question the source material leaves us with is this. Knowing you don't control the final outcome of the world, are you still showing up and fulfilling your specific duty today? Are you building your wall, protecting your community, and doing what is right now? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the texts, and I'll leave you to reflect on that question.